Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I forgot to introduce myself last night. My name is Steve Dowden. I think in the meantime, Tom Quinn and I have met everybody. Tom Quinn and I have known each other for about 30 years, so we've really met. And we've been working together with Sabine van Mering and with Detlef Gericke Schönhagen on putting this production together. So let me welcome you on behalf of this unusual conversation, and we'll get started this morning with a few words from Tom as he structures what we're going to say to each other.
Okay, and I will start by allowing some people to exercise more than others. The people who are here will exercise more because they can turn their head in that way right now, and they can discover the first typographical error. If this works.
Institute.
Very good. Who said that? And I will start with a well-known German thinker. And I'll start with sort of some good news first. Now, I don't know how many people can't speak German, so I'll sort of like use both languages at once. I mean, here is whoever has survived a tragedy, which means the good news is that everybody here has either not had a tragedy or they survived it. Okay, that would be the good news. The bad news is that none of you are here as tragic heroes. Which, you got it. Okay. And that probably is sort of a trite insight, or maybe it's not an insight at all, but it should tell us that we should think about what the concepts are we have of tragedy before we start the conversation. And I think you'll notice that this is the reflection of a certain understanding of what the tragedy, of what tragic is, what tragedy is. So if you wanted to come and become a tragic hero, you already have lost. Okay. We didn't really know how to start, so I'll start this way. So in order that you can gauge your expectations, at least with respect to me, I will try, and I emphasize the word try, I'll come back to this later, I will try to do three things. One in English, one in German, and the language of the third part depends on the comfort of whoever's speaking. First, I will try to describe or circumscribe what we might do, or try to do the next couple of days, and how we might do it. Second, I will try to build a dialogical bridge back to Felicitas. Where is Felicitas? Here. Back to Felicitas' talk last night, and use it to cross into some of the other topics that I think should come up. And third, with respect to our conversation, as Steve called it, about the tragic, well, let's just do it. Let me begin with the word that Felicitas used at the end of her keynote address. It is a key word, maybe the key word, Gespräch. I suppose everyone knows what the word means, but then again, since it means something to everyone, it may have as many different meanings as we have different people. Part of what we'll be doing for the next couple of days will be to find meanings for a few key words. Finding meanings for words often means creating meanings. When it comes to words and text, when it comes to things to be interpreted, the relationship between finding meaning and creating meaning is often closer than we think. How close? Maybe as close to each other as the German words finden und erfinden. We, Steve and I, did not know what word would best describe what we were planning to do. We did know, however, that the word we would finally choose should give a special meaning to what we're trying to do. Steve chose by chance or premonition, by fate or critical reason, the word conversation, which means, among other things, Gespräch. He did this without knowing what the meaning of the word or how meaningful the word would be for Felicitas. And I'm pretty sure that Felicitas did not know that Steve used the word conversation to describe what he hoped for the next couple of days. For those of us who have read our Gadamer, we could probably ask whether Gespräch or conversation is Wahrheit or Methode. Is conversation the method of finding truth, or is conversation the truth we're trying to find? We might also ask whether the key word in Gadamer's Wahrheit und Methode was neither Wahrheit nor Methode, but rather und. These would be useful questions, but I suggest we pursue them during the coffee break or later in the day when we turn the coffee into wine. When Steve chose the word conversation, my search began to find or to create a meaning for the word. I started with what I considered the heart of the word and asked myself, what does the word converse mean? I had no trouble remembering what it once meant to me. It was the name of a rubber company in Malden, less than 10 miles from here, not far from my home. The Converse Rubber Company produced the sneakers worn by the then world champion Boston Celtics. But as fate would have it, the beginning and the end of my basketball career were more or less simultaneous. This is the second time I used the word fate, and I do not feel comfortable using it, especially in a conversation about the tragic. Was it fate that caused Steve and Felicitas to find the same word in different languages? Was it fate that ended my basketball career at its beginning? Is there such a thing as good fate in the former case and bad fate in my case? Amor fati in any case? I don't think I believe in fate, and I should probably not use words I don't believe. With the end of my basketball career, it was time to create a new meaning for the word converse, because I, thanks to or despite Germanistic, because I came to feel more at home with poetic freedom than rigid scholarship, the heart of the word converse turned into something not to put on my feet, but rather something more likely to fill my soul. I have learned not to strictly distinguish between poetic freedom from rigorous scholarship. I tend to think poetic freedom is the basis of rigid scholarship. But this too might be saved for a coffee break or when the first glass of wine is turned into the second. At any rate, I decided to put my poetic freedom into play when trying to create a meaning for the word conversation. Not surprising and not totally arbitrarily, verse became the word's center of my attraction, the not so hidden object of my desire. And con was the prefix to prevent poetry from becoming a lonely monologue. I decided, and I think meaning is always a type of decision, I decided to create the following meaning. I have simply done what the word does, combined con with verse. In a sense, our conversation should or could become something like making poetry together, coming together to turn phrases, helping each other circle in on a few key words. Let me return to or reverse back to our word conversation, our Gespräch. It looks like Steve and Felicitas used the same word in different languages, but did they use the same word for the same reason? Did the word mean the same for both? For Felicitas, Gespräch offers the possibility of freedom, Befreiung, freedom from the tragische Zwang zur Selbsterlösung. For Steve, I think conversation meant liberation from another type of tragische Zwang, what might be called the tragische Zwang zur Selbsterlösung durch Wissenschaft, a tragic compulsion of many scholars to equate a certain understanding of reason with redemption. Perhaps food for thought, a reason to drink more coffee, and later still another glass of wine. To what extent was Nietzsche's book on tragedy an attempt to free himself and us from the predominance of a certain type of reason in scholarship, and not just in scholarship? In the next couple of days, conversation and Gespräch will be one, or should I say two, of the words for which we will try to create meaning. Tragic will be another key word. If one thing became clear upon reading the contributions to the volume we're planning, it is possibly this: there is not just one meaning to the word tragic. We should try to focus on what the different meanings are and what the different meanings mean, not just to Büchner and Goethe, not just to Hölderlin and Nietzsche, and to Benjamin and Heidegger, and to Adorno, Arendt, and Hopper. We should also ask what they mean to ourselves. I think we should not try to converse about literature. I think it would be better to converse not about literature, but rather with literature. I think it would be better not to say things about literature, but to ask what literature says about us, to us. At the risk of alienating Felicitas, I could ask if last night she was literature, trying to speak with us, to us. Maybe this is what our conversation about the tragic should be: a Gespräch with literature and with each other about both literature and us. More food for thought, a reason to drink. Will scholarship frown upon us that we are here just for a conversation, for just a Gespräch? A young philologist once wrote that being here, Dasein, could only be justified as an aesthetic phenomenon. Needless to say, the philologist in question reaped the scorn of his fellow scholars. Nur als ästhetisches Phänomen ist das Dasein gerechtfertigt, was the way Nietzsche put it. Can our being here, our scholarly existence, be justified just by a conversation? When Steve and I discussed what we wanted to try for the next couple of days, he said, trying a conversation in this type of context would be an experiment, which led me to search for, or to create, to reverse the meaning of another word, experiment. As many philologists know, like Nietzsche and the Greek-thinking, German-writing Heidegger, there are cases when one language can help us understand another. For an experiment at the Goethe Institute, it seemed sensible enough to turn to German for help. In German, one word for experiment is Versuch, which is also the word for what many of us try to write, an essay. Versuch has its roots in the word suchen. A Versuch is a type of searching, a search. Search is the basic word in an activity that scholars not seldom use to justify their existence. And if I, so to speak, reverse the word Versuch, we might claim we are doing something at least close to research, or close to what research could or should be, a search. With a bit of imagination, we may even find some justification for using the word research. Research. Scholars trying to redeem themselves by finding something to justify their being here, their Dasein at a conversational experiment, at the Versuch eines Gesprächs, might find some consolation in this turn of the phrase. I realize that consolation is not redemption, but maybe in the context of a conversation about the tragic, we might come to the conclusion that redemption is not possible, that consolation might be the very best we can do. Another thought for Apollonian conversations over coffee or later Dionysian discourses over wine. Versuch also means try. Without changing anything, I can turn the word Versuch from a noun into a verb. More exactly, into a verb that asks us to do something, an imperative. Versuch, try, experiment. In other words, a conversation about the tragic, ein Gespräch über das Tragische. Versuchen wir, let's try it. Let me turn now to the second part of what I want to do and return to Felicitas and what she said, at least what she said to me last night. Another word for Gespräch is Zwiesprache, which usually means not two languages, but two people speaking the same language, trying to say something to each other. Looking backward, maybe it was my first pre-Heidegger lesson in Geworfenheit, or thrownness. Maybe it was a throwback to my non-existent basketball career. One of the things I learned is, if someone throws a basketball to you, don't throw back a baseball in return. Felicitas threw German at me, so I will, in a manner of speaking, throw German back to her. I know that language is not a ball, but it might be the field on which we play. Maybe it is in fact the game itself. So, to play the game on her field, or better, to play her game, which is also my game, I will play in German. As anyone at the Goethe Institute Boston knows, German is a whole different ballgame. Liebe Felicitas, ganz zu Beginn deiner Geschichte, zu der Geschichte, die deine Lebensgeschichte geworden ist, findet man die Stadt Hameln. Berühmt wegen einer Hoppe, die 2012 den Büchner-Preis gefangen hat. Berüchtigt wegen eines Rattenfängers, der 1284 fast alle Kinder der Stadt entführt hat. Obwohl du in deiner Erzählung Hoppe suggerierst, dass die Kinder eigentlich nicht aus der Stadt entführt, sondern vor der Stadt gerettet wurden. Da klingt zum ersten Mal unser Thema an, das Tragische. Du sagst, deine deutsche Heimat bleibt bis heute tragisch grundiert. Mit viel Fantasie kann ich mir eine postmoderne Imitation von Nietzsche vorstellen. Die Geburt der Tragödie deiner Geburtsstadt aus dem Geist der Musik eines Rattenfängers. Verlassen wir den Rattenfänger. Kommen wir zu dem Spiel, das wir selber sind. Ob Trauerspiel, ob Lustspiel, the play must go on. Und in diesem Spiel haben wir alle eine kleine, aber nicht deshalb unbedeutende Rolle. Wie du sagst, in einer Armee von so trauriger wie mutiger Schauspieler. Warum sind sie traurig? Warum mutig? Vielleicht beides aus einem selben Grund. Denn, ich zitiere, falls Sie es jemals wussten, spätestens jetzt wissen Sie nicht mehr, wovon eigentlich die Rede ist. Wittgenstein schrieb einmal, wovon man nicht sprechen kann, davon sollte man schweigen. Ich denke, wir reden und schreiben umso mehr, wenn wir nicht wissen, wovon die Rede ist. Wer weiß besser, wovon ich rede, als die hier versammelten Wissenschaftler? Worum geht es in diesem Spiel? Was für ein Spiel ist das überhaupt? Mir scheint, du gibst wenigstens indirekt Antworten. Zum Beispiel, es wird auf einer sehr weltlichen, allzu menschlichen Bühne gespielt. Wie du sagst, es ist kein göttliches Spiel, was es das je war. Es ist ein Gesellschaftsspiel, das die Beziehungen zwischen Göttern und Menschen entschieden in die zwischenmenschlichen Hierarchien verlegt. Fragen gibt es in diesem Spiel viele, aber keine Glaubensfragen, sondern Vertrauensfragen. Von Menschen gestellt, von Menschen zu beantworten. Gibt es keine Glaubensfragen, weil es keinen Gott gibt? an den wir noch glauben? Oder gibt es vielleicht doch noch einen Gott, nur wir glauben an ihn nicht mehr? Von einer Theodizee-Frage, wie kann man Gott rechtfertigen angesichts der Existenz des Bösen? Von dieser Frage finde ich in deiner Rede keine Spur. Interessanterweise, konsequenterweise, das Wort Böse findet man auch nicht in deiner Rede. Offensichtlich kann man über das Tragische sprechen, ohne über das Böse sprechen zu müssen. Wenigstens hast du es getan. Du sprichst nicht ausdrücklich von einem Tod Gottes. Du sprichst eher von einer Befreiung von den Göttern. Ob der Tod Gottes unsere Befreiung wäre, das sagst du nicht. Auch nicht, dass sein Leben uns unfrei gemacht hätte oder unfrei machen würde. Du sagst einfach, mit der Emanzipation von den Göttern ist die Kunst zu Ende, die auf menschliche Katastrophen höhere Antworten geben will. Das Ende der einen Kunst war Anfang der anderen Kunst. Was für eine Kunst? Eine, die nicht ohne menschliche Katastrophen ist. Und vielleicht eine, die nicht ohne Antworten auf diese Katastrophen ist. Nur, insofern diese Kunst Antworten geben will oder kann, sind sie nicht Antworten von oben. Keine höheren Antworten. In unserem Spiel geht es um das Tragische, auch wenn es dabei sehr menschlich spricht, gelegentlich sehr komisch zugeht. Und im Spiel um das Tragische geht es nicht nur um das Tragische, sondern eher gegen das Tragische. Genauer, es geht um die Überwindung des Tragischen. Aber wenn es um die Überwindung des Tragischen geht, geht es eigentlich nicht um das Tragische, sondern eher um dessen Gegenteil. Dann scheint es mir um das Glück zu gehen. Aber wir wollen nicht unser Trauerspiel Glücksspiel nennen. Wie du sagtest, Gattungsbegriffe helfen hier nicht weiter. Nun gut, du sprichst natürlich nur indirekt von der Überwindung des Tragischen. Du machst die Überwindung nicht zum Hauptthema. Sie ist aber das tragende Thema. Sie trägt die anderen Themen auf ihrem Rücken wie ein freundlicher Riese, verängstigte Kinder nachts durch den dunklen Wald trägt. Der Riese spricht nicht sehr viel, ist dabei aber weniger sprachlos als die Kinder, die aus Angst nervös durcheinander reden, als könnten sie mit dem Reden gar nicht aufhören. Wenn aber der Riese spricht, dann sagt er Unerhörtes und man hört gut zu. Wir haben uns zu merken, es ist gegen die Natur von Riesen, dass sie Hybris begehen, denn von Natur aus sind Riesen Hybris. Felicitas, du sprichst ein Riesenthema an und wenn du es ansprichst, sprichst du eine religiöse Sprache und schreibst uns Menschen, den traurigen, aber mutigen Schauspielern, die wir sind, etwas zu, was sonst eher einem Gott zugeschrieben wird. Und hier sprichst du nicht nur, hier benutzt du zum ersten Mal einen Imperativ, der uns ebenso schmeichelt wie uns vielleicht überfordert. Weißt du, wovon ich rede? Wovon du redest? Erlöse dich selbst, sagst du. Warum denn das? Deine Antwort, der Satz geht weiter, denn sonst erlöst dich keiner. Hier sagst du, hört das Spiel auf, oder hier beginnt das Spiel im Ernst. Dich selbst erlösen. Das allerdings, sagst du, ist mühsam. Ein Spiel schon gar nicht. Selbsterlösung ist reine Arbeit. Du nennst für dein Erlöse dich selbst einen Grund, verschweigst dabei natürlich einen anderen. Der eine Grund, den du nennst, denn sonst erlöst dich keiner, ist eigentlich nicht der erste Grund, sondern der zweite. Der erste Grund ist, weil wir Erlösung brauchen. Vielleicht hast du diesen Grund gar nicht verschwiegen. Vielleicht ist es dir so selbstverständlich, dass wir Erlösung suchen und brauchen, dass man es gar nicht sagen muss, da im Fall der Erlösung jeder weiß, wovon die Rede ist. Selbst vielleicht vor allem traurig mutige Schauspieler wie wir. Hier kommt einiges zusammen. Das Tragische, Erlösung, Selbsterlösung, Glück und endlich wieder eines von Kleist. Kleist, der, wie du sagst, sein Leben lang Selbsterlösungspläne schmiedete. Kleist, den nennst du gegen Ende den absoluten Glückssucher. Selbsterlösung und Glück. Zwei Seiten der Glücksmünze, die du offen und heimlich mit dir in deiner Hexentasche herumträgst, um dich vor dem Tragischen zu schützen. Gegen Ende deiner Rede scheinst du mir sogar zu sagen, wie diese Erlösung vonstatten gehen soll. Zum zweiten Mal beschreibst du nicht, du befiehlst. Wenigstens benutzt du zum zweiten und letzten Mal den Imperativ. Hier spricht keine verzweifelte Hopper. Hier spricht eine gläubige Hopper, keine gottgläubige Hopper, sondern eine Hopper, die an sich und an ihre Kunst glaubt. Hopper sagt, erzähle dich selbst. Es folgt kein denn oder wenn oder weil, aber auch kein Punkt. Hier steht ein Ausrufezeichen. Eine kleine, aber unmissverständliche Hoffnung. Erzähle dich selbst, Hopper, denn sonst erzählt dich keiner. Ohne erzählen zu können, wäre Selbsterlösung nicht nur reine Arbeit, sondern die reine Sisyphus-Arbeit. Ist Kunst die Lösung zu dem Problem, das sich im Tragischen versteckt? Erlöse dich selbst. Ist dieser Imperativ eigentlich die Frage, auf die der zweite Imperativ die Antwort ist? Erlöse dich selbst. Warum? Weil du Erlösung brauchst und weil sonst keiner dich erlöst. Wie? Erzähle dich selbst. So wirst du, wer du bist. Noch mehr, so wirst du als Sterblicher auch ein bisschen unsterblich. So wirst du dann noch zu lesen sein, wenn du längst nicht mehr zu sprechen bist. Versucht hast du es. Aus Felicitas wurde Hopper. So versuchst du aus dem tragischen Zwang zur Selbsterlösung eine Erzählung zu machen oder gar eine Erzählung zu sein. Erzähle dich selbst. Steckt nicht darin, was bei der Armee von traurigen, mutigen Schauspielern droht, in Vergessenheit zu geraten? Keine hochtrabende Seinsvergessenheit aller Heidegger, eher eine Sei-Vergessenheit aller Hopper. Vergesse nie zu sein, wer du bist. Sei, wer du bist. Erzähle dich selbst. Steckt nicht darin, wovon die Rede war, als wir noch wussten, wovon die Rede war? Erzähle dich selbst. Selbsterfindung, Selbstfindung und Selbsterlösung in einem. Autobiografie, Identität und ein Stück diesseitiger Transzendenz. Keine andere Art der Transzendenz scheint uns Menschen angemessen zu sein. Es ist eine Transzendenz, die nicht in den Himmel führt, aber doch über den irdischen Abgrund der Fragen, die wir stellen müssen, ohne sie immer beantworten zu können. Manche unserer Antworten sind tragisch, manche einfach nur komisch. So oder so, reine Arbeit, sagtest du. Und bei dieser Arbeit gibt es keine Arbeitslosen. Am Schluss deiner Rede lernen wir ein bisschen von den letzten Verbrecher oder Versager. Wir lernen ihn ein bisschen kennen, den du in deinem kleinen Erzählband porträtierst. So lernen wir etwas über ihn, über dich und so lernen wir auch etwas über uns und über das Tragische. Du sprichst von einem Appell. Nun, ein Appell ist ein versteckter Imperativ. Ohne Ausrufezeichen, vielleicht eher mit einem Fragezeichen. Die Frage richtet sich an uns alle. Du beschreibst sie als eine Bitte. Eine Bitte um flüchtige Aufmerksamkeit und Anhörung. Diese Bitte haben wir dir entsprochen. Angehört haben wir und zugehört. Nicht zuletzt, weil wir dazugehören, zu den Verbrechen und Versagen. Ich komme zum Schluss, zu meinem Schluss und zu deinem Schluss. Zu der Bitte um flüchtige Aufmerksamkeit und Anhörung. Es ist eine besondere Bitte. Nicht nur entscheidend, sondern vielleicht auch erlösend. Und sie bindet uns zusammen zu einer Art Schicksalsgemeinschaft. Du sagst, es ist eine Bitte um das, wonach wir uns alle sehnen. Vielleicht das Einzige, was uns aus dem tragischen Zwang zur Selbsterlösung befreien könnte. Warum wird gebeten? Der letzte Verbrecher und Versager bittet um das Gespräch. So holst du den Gedanken der Erlösung aus dem Himmel auf die Erde, aus dem Schweigen ferner Götter in die Sprache von uns tragikomischen Menschen, in die Zwiesprache, die wir mit Glück werden können. In diesem Gespräch wissen Verbrecher und Versager meistens sehr gut, wovon die Rede ist. Denn sie sind besondere Künstler. Sie sind Lebenskünstler. Lebenskünstler vergessen nie, dass es immer um die Kunst des Gesprächs geht, was immer mehr ist als ein Gespräch über Kunst. Let me reverse, now converse, briefly in English. If I ask myself to summarize what I said about you, there were 3 or 4 questions I posed to Felicitas, to myself and to all of us. What do you mean by tragic? In your address last night, you first used it to describe the way your city, Hamlin, defined itself. After the Pied Piper seduced all but two of the city's children. What do you mean by erlöse dich selbst? For believers of the first type of art, this is sort of like blasphemy. For the people of the second type, it's probably at least ultimate hubris. Redemption is something that's not necessarily impossible, but just necessary. What is the relationship between erlöse dich selbst and erzähle dich selbst? Between self-redemption and self-narration, between redeeming yourself and telling your story, between saving yourself and narrating creatively yourself, between redeeming yourself and justifying yourself as an aesthetic phenomenon, to refer to what Nietzsche said. The last question, at least for the moment, to what extent, if to any extent at all, can Gespräch, what Steve was looking for, how can Gespräch deliver us from the evil of tragedy, if in fact it's an evil at all? So now I'll turn it over to Steve.
It sounds like you directed a lot of questions to Felicitas.
Because she directed a lot of questions to us.
So the question that leaps to my mind is this one of redemption and narration. Redemption, you said, is probably an impossibility, and you related to consolation. What is it we want from the tragic? I think of the tragic in the grandest terms in three great regimes. First, the regime of Aristotle, from the Greeks up to the 18th century. Aristotle described tragedy. People worked hard to stage tragedies or Trauerspiel and try to understand what he meant. Then the question fell into the hands of German philosophers and writers, Hegel, Schelling, Schiller, Hölderlin, and a few more. And then Nietzsche brought it all to a head. In this book, Nietzsche comes up a great deal. And what I take from Nietzsche, but also from a lot of other places, maybe especially Hölderlin, is the concept that, there's also the regime of the word tragic in everyday speech, which we've talked about already, some of us in the past few days. Is this an inflation that reduces, that impoverishes the meaning or the concept of tragedy, if it is a concept? Or does it demonstrate that tragedy is something, an idea, a concept that we can't do at all without? My thinking today is that the use of the word tragedy in everyday speech, I was reading about a tragedy in Austin, Texas this morning in the newspaper. A hit and run incident had to be described as tragedy. The word tragedy imparts a sense of ethical meaning and ethical importance. In other words, without tragedy, all you have is raw grief. And the only way to get a handle on raw grief is to somehow narrate it, give it form. And this is something you said last night. I can't quite quote your comment right now, but it's formgeben, I think you said. Is that right? So the ethical importance of tragedy is that it gives form to raw grief.
Well, you're way ahead of me. You're way ahead of me because you've presupposed lots of things that I can't really presuppose. Like, you presuppose that tragedy is about literature.
No.
I don't presume that. I think maybe literature sometimes is about tragedy, but not the other way around. And I think you come close to talking about it in the sense that, if I ask, when you ask about tragedy, what is tragedy? It depends who you ask. And I've tried to figure out how we would approach this thing. Let's say I walking the streets, probably not Newby Street and probably not Beacon Street, but some other street, and I come across a black person missing one leg, having no shoes. Now that's not correct. When they have one leg, you only have one shoe, so I shouldn't use plural with shoes. And begging. And since the person can't speak English, but some African language which I can't speak, I really don't know what happened. But were it possible to ask this person something about tragic, they probably wouldn't be able to respond. But they might know much more about it than us. Now, if I ask a professor of literature or a philosopher about tragedy, they start telling me not about Africa, not about poverty, not about a missing leg. They start talking about Aristotle and Schelling and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and all these people. And so I don't know. It depends who you ask. So I asked you, so I got probably the type of answer that is absolutely correct. But it's not the type of answer that would have helped me understand the person on the road with one leg and no shoes and probably knew a lot about tragic, had probably what we would call a tragic experience. So I understand like what we would probably try to do, I guess, is ask this person on the roadside, say the desubs, tell me your story. Mm-hmm. And I probably would have a great understanding of tragedy.
But that's the same answer. That's the same answer. Literature, he's giving it form. In speech he gives it form. In conversation he gives it form. It's just that writers are maybe easier to talk about, playwrights, poets, because they're the people who are best at giving things form.
Well, I think if I understand for this, that's, poets don't write about poets. They write about people.
No, they write about experience.
But they write about people's experience, not poets' experience. So I think it's a... We have a lot of questions now, so...
All right. You're the moderator. Moderator.
No, you're the moderator.
Okay.
I'm not a moderator.
It seems to me sensible to be able to...
Do we need to use the microphones?
Can you hear me?
Okay, good.
I'll try to speak up. It seems to me sensible at the outset, I suppose, to be able to become comfortable with a few different levels of the word tragic. Because I think otherwise we're going to be getting into a tussle over whether tragedy is about life or about art. But what the Gespräch that you're getting into right now might allow us to say, on the one hand, there is the use of the word tragedy simply to describe human suffering. And maybe even someone's going to say, well, what about non-human suffering? But let's just say, for the purposes of the moment, human suffering. And then there is the art and the philosophy and the narrative about human suffering. So rather than deciding between your positions, maybe we want to say that tragedy can describe experience, but that's one use of the term tragedy, the experience of suffering. What much of the history of literature, art, and thought is talking about is what human beings do with that suffering. So there's experience and there's reflection on the experience. And that's why I want to say that's a great response, Stephen, which is that once this hypothetical person starts to tell you the story, that's when it becomes tragic. Not the raw suffering itself, but the fact that that person, hypothetically, would give that story a beginning. I came from that place.
I think we've talked about this, so part of this is like we always agree to disagree. But I think, like, for example, what you said to me is that I don't think there's such a thing as a fact that is tragic. I think tragic is always the interpretation of a fact. So I think it's sort of like a hermeneutical achievement to use the word tragic at all.
I don't talk about facts. I don't think I said anything about facts. I said about experiences. And those are two quite different things. Facts can be calculated. Experiences must be lived through. But then there are experiences that we have at the raw level and then experiences that we reflect upon that need not take place in literature or art or philosophy. But what it does usually require is time and distance. At least distance. I mean, can you experience tragedy as tragedy whilst it's at its, raw?
If you're on the reflective level, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
Or is that suffering? Already tragedy is where there is a possibility. And I suppose that goes back to the idea of if there can be tragedy, you have to have survived it enough to be able to put it in the context. The moment at which
or somebody must be able to have survived to talk about those who didn't survive.
There has to be Horatio to tell the story.
Okay.
Jeff.
This is why I think I don't want to throw a baseball back at your basketball. So let me try and formulate this.
Take my football.
I'm very sympathetic to the idea that tragedy is about life first and foremost. But the reason that leads me to think that it has more to do with form or with Vorstellung is that precisely what Jennifer had just said. If we use the examples of, either example you gave, what would be the value or function of calling the experience tragic as opposed to something like horrific? It strikes me that if there is a difference, it would have to be precisely in the being able to tell the story, which is to say, attain some reflective distance or some, if not reflective distance, some retrospective quality to it. One would have to be out the other side. Otherwise, it is unmitigated suffering. And isn't that at least as easily described as horrific?
Yeah, go ahead and mention that.
Okay. When we were first trying to organize what we're trying to organize now still, we talked about horror because we wanted to invite Stephen King to this thing. And the reason we wanted to invite Stephen King was in our various conversations we talked about, well, how do you distinguish horror from tragic? And at that time, Stephen King had just written the book about the assassination of Kennedy, right? And so, I wrote this incredible letter, which I don't know how we could have rejected. We couldn't read it. But anyway, why we thought about this was the following, that this was like, if you ask Americans, you get sometimes a prototypical answer like, what is the American tragedy? Well, before 9/11 was probably the assassination of Kennedy. So everybody could associate some of this happening. And so this book is an incredible idea, is that he apparently had a long time trying to come to grips with the idea of Kennedy's assassination. And so finally he wrote this book about it. And it's actually a book about a time machine. And the time machine is a trick where he tries to go back in time far enough to the day before the assassination so he can prevent the tragedy. So I think writing about tragedy, and this is maybe something like you've talked about, is that he writes this tragedy in his mind to prevent it from happening, right? And so that's why we thought this horror author would have been a great person here because, like, first of all, you don't think of horror stories as tragedy. You think of this, the level of tragedy is, that word is up here, and the level of diction and horror is sort of like, it's here, right? But when you look at the story behind it, like, this guy is, you know, critically trying to come to grips with the American tragedy in his own way of doing it, and he uses a Deus Ex Machina, which is a time machine, to get us back to the point, like, could we have avoided it, right? And it's sort of like for the Max Frisch friends who are looking at Max Frisch's thing, Biografie ein Spiel, he says, if you got to live your life again, would you do it differently, right? And so he's playing this in a historical framework, like would we have changed American history if we were able to do it? Well, we would have had one tragic figure less. Kennedy might not have been a tragic figure if he lived, right? He would have been a tragic figure like Clinton, maybe the way, I don't know. But at any rate, I don't know, these words we're separating words like horror and tragic. It's as difficult as translate experience in literature.
Well, in terms of genre, I think tragedy has migrated into horror because tragedy is such a high culture, highbrow kind of a thing as an art form. You know, I think there's a real powerful need for tragedy, and it's expressed in popular culture as horror. Helmut.
As a historian, I think about the following kind of question with respect to your story. One of the implications, as I take it, of Erich Auerbach's Mimesis is that the bringing of tragic seriousness to a story like this is a very modern, in fact, in his argument, a 19th century phenomenon that has a kind of deficiency in the German tradition. So what that means, of course, is that someone like Martin Luther, thinking about what we would think of as a tragedy, the Peasants' War, where 100,000, some 100,000 peasants are basically run over by armies, he would not say that's tragic. And without knowing the exact texts, I feel fairly certain in saying that he had a different vocabulary for it, with a whole series of consequences. So I'm just saying that story that you tell is gripping.
His story or my story?
Your story, right. But I also think it helps to remember that the coordinates in which we would call that tragic are very modern.
Well, I hear what you say, but also the coordinates we're using are coming from Greece, which was before Martin Luther. So it's not that clear to me, and I think we probably need more questions to get closer to more answers. I'm not sure. Ma?
First, Klaus had his hand up first, then Mark, then Josh.
What I thought Felicitas' presentation yesterday pointed at was at the idea of the worst of tragedy, that the tragic, as opposed to the genre of tragedy or the philosophy of the tragic, would be still a last screen that protects us. As you said, it's a sort of relief to know that something is tragic. That in fact, let's say read it through Kleist, when Kleist thwarts all easy classifications of genre, calls it Schauspiel, Trauerspiel, Lustspiel, Ritterschauspiel, and you call it Protestin or Tragikomödie, then those are all forms that thwart the idea of the tragic in its, let's say, horrible dimension as a force that has to create something above us, as the horror of human life, of failure. I think as soon as we begin to read the worst of tragic, and we still would like to salvage a tragic force, I think we have to contemplate with Felicitas that what is worse than the tragic through figures such as the Heilige, the saint, the comedic core in the tragic, to which Felicitas also pointed. I would also add the crisis of death that contemporary biopolitics points out. But I would also point out, as in Kleist, how much he insisted on the idea of haunting, on hauntology, so to say, on that what continues to come back, but in a fashion that is no longer in the tragic economy of a fate that returns, but more in the sense of an infinite and no longer determinable, let's say, as Benjamin calls it, of an indeterminable haunting that no longer can be fixated as a tragic moment. So I fear that we designate the tragic as the worst, but in fact have invented a last screen.
Mark?
Yeah, I want to add two thoughts on defining the tragic. I think one dimension is that perhaps the tragic doesn't change, but our understanding of the tragic changes. And since you mentioned Auerbach, actually I disagree a little bit with what you said. One of the interesting passages in Auerbach is where he talks about the Gospel of Mark and St. Peter denying Christ 3 times. And he says, this belongs in comedy because you have a servant, a lowly figure, the language is low, the servant thinks he knows more than the master, but the master really knows more than the servant. And he's a lowly person, he's not a public figure, he's a lowly fisherman. But when he denies Christ 3 times and weeps, Auerbach says, that is tragic. That is the revolution of Christianity, that the lowliest person, the servant, the ugliest person, if you will, has, in a certain sense, human dignity, and that elevates the person to tragedy. That is a historical transformation in the evolution of tragedy. And Steve, you're alluding to a further change, perhaps, into horror. I'm not sure I agree with it, but one way to understand tragedy is historically. The other way, I think, and perhaps even the two could be combined, is systematically. For me, one of the interesting tensions in the book is that when we take the experience of suffering and give it form, there are different concepts of what that form is or should be. For example, Adorno does not allow either tragedy or comedy in the modern world. Humor is abscheulich for him, abstoßend, I think is his word, excuse me, because it allows for some kind of reconciliation. And that is untenable in modern art. But tragedy is also untenable because it has a positive moment. And one systematic question is, does tragedy affirm, as Steve Dowden said, or, as some others said, is it only about the missing moment, the lack of connection, the lack of meaning? And then I want to add one other formal distinction that one could make systematically, and that is whether we understand any suffering as tragic, or, as Hegel would have it, also Scheler, and would be another one, an organic link between greatness and suffering. For Hegel, it is the greatness of the individual who pursues the good and simultaneously has to negate the good, and that leads to suffering and destruction. So it's an organic link between greatness and suffering. The organic, obviously, since Plato is an important element of great art, but one of the revolutions in modernity is that sometimes you have a reverse organic link, where the suffering does not result from greatness, but in suffering you see a certain greatness. King Lear would be a great example of that. And his suffering comes from his stupidity, but how he carries that suffering forth gives us a certain sense of greatness. There you see an organic link. That would be a different systematic definition of tragedy, one that I actually would want to defend.
We have to decide, should we just keep taking questions, or should we ask questions about the questions? Which weren't questions, but rather answers. I think
it's a hard choice. I think we should just go with the people who have their hands up and then follow the threads that we can, because I think a lot of threads are going to emerge. Okay. So first Josh, and then Joe, and then Rob.
Okay.
I'm afraid that this will create some whiplash as we're sort of going back and forth between different strands of the conversation. But I want to pick up on seems to me that there's a sort of illusion of the tragic as a trans-historical phenomenon, or tragedy is one thing that goes through history. I mean, I would call that an illusion. I think we could reduce it to the point that it was not an illusion, but that I think would be to reduce it to almost meaninglessness. So I'm uncomfortable with saying something like the tragic does not change, but our concepts of it do, which I think was the previous comment. I guess I would wonder, how can we talk about concepts changing without the thing itself changing? That as an interpretive move makes no sense to me. And I guess to bring it back to the book, I was struck in reading by sort of two general ways of understanding the title, or a focus either on tragedy or on the tragic. And there are some of the papers, the ones that I think I most appreciated, and tried to mediate between them. But those to me seem like very different questions. The tragic is a question that is relatively modern and relatively confined to a philosophical framework. Tragedy is a question that as Jennifer's comment suggested, is both a sort of historical literary one, and I want to distinguish historical within it, and a experiential one. And so that's sort of another matrix on which we might see those differentiations.
Joe?
Yeah, there's two things I think I want to say right now. First of all, since you invited some kind of reflection out of experience, I'll tell a little story of my own, and then I'll get to my big point. Okay, the little story of my own is I grew up in the hills of Kentucky in a situation where there were murders and suicides and prison terms and men who beat their wives and so forth and so on. That was kind of the world that I grew up in. I then went into the academy, found myself surrounded by liberal intellectuals who were appalled by the fact that I was interested in the great philosophers, and I was interested in great works of literature. How could you possibly pursue interests like that when there's actual people out there suffering? Right? It just seemed appalling that you would look to high culture. And one thing that always bothered me is that the world I came from, which was a world that had a lot of suffering in it, as I just said, was a world of people who played banjos and guitars and so forth and so on, for whom bluegrass music was something that made it possible to live. They were people for whom the Book of Job was a work that one reads over and over and over and over because it makes it possible to live. Okay, and so in a sense, I always had the feeling that the liberal intellectuals around me, whose hearts were so open to the suffering of the world and so forth, were somehow not getting something in terms of what that suffering made necessary. That is to say, it made necessary something like culture and high culture and so forth and so on. And now, with regard to the point I want to make from that, I'd like to describe what I think might be a tragedy in the making. And the tragedy in the making would work roughly like this. We decide that we can no longer give meaning to suffering by finding the right aesthetic form that somehow can reconcile oneself to suffering. We decide that that's illegitimate and it detracts our attention from the real issue, which is to abolish suffering. And so we set out to abolish suffering, which means we try to attain power over nature, power over everything, so that we can get rid of suffering. And the tragedy in the making would be that the more we grow that power to get rid of suffering, the more we basically grow the power that falls in the hands of evil people, and with the result that the great catastrophe, we willed only to rid humanity of suffering, and we end up abolishing humanity off of the face of the earth. And that would be my plea for a kind of old-fashioned notion that tragedy as literature, as an aesthetic form, may be something that we really do need in order to accept the fact that as finite human beings, we're going to suffer. We're not going to get rid of it.
I guess I would just comment on that. There was a question last night, should Faust have been saved or not saved? I think Joe just condemned Faust, just so that we should recognize that.
Rob.
This is another stone thrown into this water that ripples, but one thing, as a political scientist, and probably maybe the only one in the room, I just want to sort of throw out that maybe there's a political dimension that we should also sort of keep in mind. And not forget that tragedy arose kind of in connection with democracy. If you look at the ancient Greek polis. And one way you can understand the connection, say, between ordinary language uses and these high culture uses is to think about the political effect. So, for example, you have Nietzsche, who says that the tragic Dionysian provokes a sense of solidarity among people who experience this tragedy together. And I think in ordinary language as well, you could think the same way. Like, for example, I'm sure that the person, you mentioned it was a car accident in Austin. Was it a car accident? So, I'm sure that, say, if there was a drunk driver, and this drunk driver is on the stand and has to make a plea to would call it a tragedy. But I'm sure the parents of the person who was killed wouldn't call that a tragedy, right? And so another example would be, 9/11 is a tragedy for many of us, but I'm sure the way that, say, bin Laden talked about it the day after, he would have said it was catastrophic what we did in the United States, but never would have called it a tragedy. So there's a set of political effects that come out of tragedy, and one of them is solidarity. That I think it's worth remembering, and it's also worth remembering once again that tragedy. These two words, tragedy and tragic, I kind of veer to a tragedy because it always brings back tragödia and that Greek experience that was very much connected to democracy.
Sylvia?
Well, thank you for this conversation because I read the book or tried to read thus far, and there are many imponderables or opposites, light and shadow. And as I was listening to what Thomas said this morning, I realized something as the idea, and he's quoting Felicitas, erzähle dich selber, erlöse dich selber. And I thought of Kant's Sapere Aude, dare to use your own reason. And I thought actually it is dare to use your own fantasy. And as one of my students said, wow, you cannot be lazy anymore. And so I think there is this moment, right, that the tragic, right, is not so much what we see, but the work that goes into it. Because if you have your one-legged person with the African language, if he just rambles about his fate, we're going to be very unimpressed. We'll just drop our buck and move on because this is not an interesting story. So there has to be this moment of work between the experience and what we then consider tragic. And I think it's this work of the writer, right? Maybe also in this democratic moment of the 18th century, this moment, dare to think for yourself, is like dare to think to take yourself seriously enough to tell your story. And what comes up in the book again and again is this moment of lack of speech. And Jeffrey and I were talking this morning about Jelinek, how she has these people who have no language, to even consider hope, and thus to think of their own situation as limited to such a degree that from the outside one might say this is really a tragic existence, because there is no way of even articulating the limitations. And so I think it's this moment of work, this being not lazy, that may be another aspect of this discussion that hasn't really come up in the book, but it comes up in the sense of there is time passing, but in that time, work takes place. And so it has to be a particular kind of tell your own story. Tell it in an interesting way. Otherwise, it's boring and therefore not fashion.
Wolfram and Sabine. And Anke.
I want to focus on the tragic and everyday speech again. And I think if you call an accident tragic, you imply something which has to do with action. It's not only suffering. It's a human being acting. It has something to do with a decision, and perhaps it has something to do with a fault. And I think there is the problem, yeah, because the story you told, all these people, yeah, where is the decision? Where's the fault? And there is something ideological in if you call their fate tragic. It's only suffering. And you see this, I think this is the problem, that the word tragic, I think even in everyday speech, even if you call an accident tragic, it has something to do with freedom, with human responsibility. And there are many, many people in the world who do not seem to have these things, who only suffer. And I think this is the point here, which is very important about this tragic and everyday speech, that it's, in a way, it claims human freedom, and in a way, it's ideological.
Can I ask a question about this question? Did Oedipus kill his father by mistake, by accident?
Pardon?
Did Oedipus kill his father by accident?
Very difficult question.
Yeah, but you said if it was an accident, it wouldn't be tragic.
He ran away from the